Hello, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment, just allowing the waiting room to convert into the actual room. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EU-Renew webinar series on Europe in the world. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Hylke Dijkstra, who will discuss his new book, which is co-authored with Laura van Alwerden, Leonard Schutte, and Giuseppe Zaccaria, and it's called The Survival of International Organizations, Institutional Responses to Existential Challenges. And this was just published in January by Oxford University Press. And excitingly, the entire book is available open access. I will include that link in the chat in just a few moments, but you can view the entire book for free online. Professor Dr. Hylke Dijkstra is full professor of international security and cooperation at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He is an expert in global governance, multilateralism, and international organizations. He studies how increasing geopolitics and deteriorating relations between states affects prospects for international cooperation. Hylke is the author or co-author of a number of books besides the one that we're discussing here today, in particular, International Organization by Bloomsbury, International Organizations and Military Affairs, published by Routledge in 2016, and Policy Making in EU Security and Defense, published by Palgrave in 2013. And I just learned that he's got a couple others in the pipeline, so we'll have to keep an eye out in the months and years to come. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Dr. Edith Drieskens. Edith is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Leuven International and European Studies Research Group of KU Leuven, where she teaches courses on international organizations, international relations theories, and academic writing. Her work explores the regional dimension of global governance from a conceptual, theoretical, and empirical point of view, focusing on the EU's functioning in multilateral settings. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Hylke of approximately 30 minutes or so, and then we will turn to Edith to kick off the discussion. She'll offer some reflections and ask a few questions, and then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to send those questions to me at any point during the webinar using the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and I will collect those questions to share with the speakers during the open question and answer session that will follow the presentations. So you can just see that Q&A button at the bottom. Just use that to send in your questions. Before we begin, I'll just begin with a few words about the EU-Renew project. The EU Research Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU-Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU-Renew, I would really like to thank Hylke and Edith for joining us today. And without further ado, I will pass the floor over to Hylke.
Well, thank you very much, Carrie, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here digitally with you in Leuven and with all of you behind the screen. I must say the last couple of weeks have been a bit of a roller coaster for many of us with the Trump election, and particularly for us it has been interesting because, as you said, we published this book in January, in the exact week of the Trump inauguration, the second attempt at America First. And then it's obviously interesting to publish a book with the title, The Survival of International Organizations. The book is indeed available online via open access for free, but I'm also happy to show all of you that the book exists in hardcover. So it's not just a PDF on the website. There's also an actual book that arrived just 2 weeks ago at my doorstep. What I'm going to do is indeed provide a number of slides for this webinar to talk everyone through the contents of the book, and then I'm very curious to hear the comments of Edith, but also all your questions back home. So please bear with me a second while I'm opening the PowerPoint. This should now work. Good. So perhaps first of all, a word of thanks to our funder. This book is the end result of a 5-year-long research project on the decline and death of international organizations. We ultimately ended up writing a book on the survival of international organizations. I think that also tells you a little bit about what you're going to be hearing over the next 30 minutes or so. But it's generally sponsored by the European Research Council, which has also contributed to the open access fees, allowing everybody to access this book. Now, I know that Donald Trump is on everybody's mind, and everybody would want to talk to me about that and about the survival of international organizations. But I think the challenges to international organizations are more fundamental. We've seen the Kazan summit in Russia in 2024, where many countries beyond the BRICS were also represented, and where they have provided plans for the reform of global governance more broadly, which also presents a considerable challenge to international organizations. Now, I'm happy to talk about Trump and about the BRICS and about all sorts of challenges that international organizations face a bit later today, but I first want to move to our book, in which we try to, at a more fundamental level, make sense of international organizations, their challenges, and also their prospects of survival. So essentially in the book, we look backwards as academics, and not necessarily forwards about predicting what Donald Trump is going to do next week to international organizations. Now, the topic of the book very much focuses on the responses of international organizations to challenges. So we've been talking a lot about the challenges itself, but this book is about international organizations and how they engage, counter, deal with all sorts of challenges they face. And the argument I'm going to be pursuing today is that international organizations can be surprisingly proactive actors when their organizations come under pressure. So we should not discard international organizations as some sort of a hapless victims that, are subject to challenges from Trump, wars, economic crises. International organizations have a considerable amount of agency, and we're going to be talking about that today. Now, I'm pursuing two types of propositions in this book. First, existential challenges require different sorts of responses. So it matters whether the United States or China is taking on international organizations, or whether international organizations, for instance, face competition from other institutions. So we really need to look more carefully at what sorts of challenges international organizations face. But equally important, and I think that's the second part of the story, is that international organizations and their main actors, they vary considerably in their own strength, in their own internal strength. Now we're going to be zooming in a little bit on their leadership qualities, their organizational structures, their embedding in external networks, and so forth. But we need to understand these type of institutional strengths of international organizations to understand how they fare when coming under challenge. Now, this book is based on case studies. We've studied 6 international organizations. Me and my colleagues have done 100+ interviews, so we've really gone into these international organizations, talked to relevant officials about behind-the-scene processes, trying to trace responses of international organizations. And I think that's the evidence base that we're building on. Now, finally, I would want to say something about what our book tells us about the here and now, and the medium term, how international organizations are likely to survive or not under Trump, under challenges of the BRICS. So let's get started. First, I want to say a few more words about our research question. So we take issue in this book essentially with what we consider an obsession in the academic literature on challenges to international organizations. I mean, everybody writes or talks about Trump, about China, about how world wars affect international organizations, legitimacy crises, and so forth. And what we often see is that scholars take a member states level of analysis. So what does Trump do, or what do populist parties within countries do? And very few scholars actually consider responses by international organizations, or what we like to call an IO level of analysis. So we argue here that challenges to international organizations, existential challenges to international organizations, are only half the picture. They're important, we need to know about them, but similarly, the other half of the picture is what international organizations do with them. So we also need to look in terms of our analysis, our level of analysis at the international organizations as such. And it's surprising in a way that a few scholars have done this, because we know from research on international public administration already for quite a while that the institutional setup, the leadership, officials, bureaucrats matter for how policy is made within international organizations. From literature in domestic politics and public administration, we already know for 5 decades that officials have agency when it comes to agency termination. Herbert Kaufman is here and a classic reference. And we also know from some quantitative studies, including earlier work by myself, that it matters whether international organizations have a lot of bureaucrats or few bureaucrats to their survival chances. The autonomy of these bureaucracies also matter. So in a way, we find it surprising in this book that this IO level of analysis remains understudied. At the same time, we also see considerable variation in IO responses. An example that we know quite well, and many of you probably as well, is the EU's response to Brexit. So after the Brexit referendum, the question was, which country comes next, right? How quickly will EU unity fall apart? But what we've seen is that the European Commission, and under Juncker, the appointment of Michel Barnier as a senior politician, really helped steer EU unity there. So very proactive type of response in bringing the EU together and engaging with Brexit. The World Trade Organization is a complete opposite. There you saw that the United States challenged the appellate body of the World Trade Organization by refusing to appoint judges. And essentially the World Trade Organization did nothing. Actually, the Director General of the World Trade Organization resigned in the middle of the COVID pandemic to take up a job elsewhere. So we see considerable variation there in terms of how international organizations potentially deal with these challenges, and we want to know essentially why. So the research question we're dealing with in this book is, why do institutional actors of IOs respond differently to existential challenges? Now, perhaps a few points here on definitions. So we consider existential challenges as those that put individual IOs at risk of no longer being able to effectively carry out some of their core functions. So if the United States takes on the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization is no longer able to carry out its dispute settlement function to the fullest. So we consider that an existential challenge, even if the World Trade Organization continues to live. Similarly, if somebody takes on, like Trump takes on Article 5 of NATO, we consider that the core function of NATO, the most important article. So if that's being put into question, we consider that an existential challenge. Similarly, it's worthwhile saying that we focus on institutional actors. These are the IO leaders and their bureaucracies who principally serve the IO institution rather than particular interests. So we're not necessarily interested in other member states within the international organization. We're really interested in the officials at the core of the IO, the people who make the IO work. So the book essentially is about international organizations themselves. I want to run then quickly through the argument of the book. So the first point we're making is that international organizations can be surprisingly proactive when put under pressure. And that challenges, in a sense, quite a bit of literature. I mean, it would challenge all sorts of realist scholars that consider international organizations marginal, but it also challenges the Barnett and Finnemore type of school that says IOs create pathologies, they're sticky, they're slow moving, they're bureaucrats, they don't change very well. So in our book, we challenge both of them. We say, listen, if international organizations are potentially put under pressure in a way that affects, say, the pension plans and livelihood of international organization bureaucrats, they're going to be very, very proactive in protecting and shielding their organization. And they can do so through behavioral responses, so things they do, as well as discursive responses, things they say. And I'll talk a little bit more about these type of options they have. Secondly, and I think this is the first big proposition of our book, is we argue that existential challenges require different sorts of responses. So we note in the book that type of direct challenges by major powers often lead to resistance. That is because it's very difficult for international organizations to adapt when, for instance, Trump challenges the core rationale of the climate regime, or China is challenging fundamental human rights norms. It's very difficult for international organizations to go along and say, well, Trump or China, you're right, our human rights norms are wrong, or climate is a hoax. So what we see to major direct challenges by major powers is we see typically some sort of resistance by international organizations. We argue, though, that if powers or groups of powers take the initiative and set up competing institutions to really try to act through different forums, we argue that the ship typically has sailed, and that it's important for incumbent international institutions to adapt. So I think that's our proposition one. Different challenges require different sorts of responses. And then proposition two in our book is that the strength of international organizations and their actors to respond to these type of challenges really depends on their internal constitution. Depends on the leadership at the top, formal competences they have, but also organizational structure. Are they well equipped to respond to challenges? And particularly important as well, they're embedding in external networks. Do they have allies? Do they have NGOs that they can fall back on? Can they make a lot of noise if they need to through type of orchestration of external networks? I promise to come back to some of these examples of responses that we can see of international organization actors protecting their organization. So we have a 2x2 table here where we list a number of examples of behavioral discursive responses in terms of adaptation, in terms of resistance. So behavioral adaptation, for instance, can be that leaders or bureaucrats in international organizations facilitate compromise between member states on mandate or institutional change. A discursive adaptive response can be that they placate challenger states, provide joint communications with competing international organizations. But we have also a series of strategies that can deal with resistance. For instance, behavioral resistance can be to sabotage efforts by challenger states and competing IOs through agenda management and other tactics. A discursive one can be to re-justify the international organizations, go on a PR offensive, and so forth. So a whole range of different responses available to institutional actors within IOs to help protect and counter their organizations. I'm moving now on to some of the evidence. So we've done 6 case studies, 100 plus interviews, and all these case studies are grouped in 3 chapters on the trade and development, climate and energy, security and defense. So we're really looking at different sorts of policy fields. And in each of these chapters, we run through the case study IOs, which are the World Trade Organization, World Bank, the UNFCCC, that's the UN Forum for Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, NATO, and then the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And for all of these case studies, we give a short description of how the international organization is constituted. We discuss the challenge they were facing, the response by institutional actors, and ultimately also the outcome of the challenge. You'll see that for each of the chapters, we focus on one direct challenge by a major power, which in all 3 cases has to do with the Trump regime and the United States challenging the World Trade Organization appellate body, the Paris Agreement, as well as NATO when it comes to burden sharing and Russia alignment. We're also studying indirect challenges, which in the case of the World Bank is the creation of the AIIB by China as an important development bank, the establishment of IRENA, that's the Renewable Energy Agency, which a number of European countries spearheaded because they were unhappy with the energy and renewable and climate commitments of the International Energy Agency, and development of European security institutions, challenging essentially the primacy of the OSCE when it comes to collective security in Europe. So a whole range of case studies, a whole range of interviews, and please consult the book and the chapters if you're interested in one of the specific cases. But what I've tried to list in the right column are the divergent responses that we've seen. Now, empirical results are always a bit messy and they never neatly map onto theoretical propositions. But I think what we do see in terms of this first proposition, and I've color-coded adaptation in green and resistance in red, is that for type of indirect challenges, we see adaptive behavior, particularly when it comes to the World Bank case. They understood that China was going to set up the AIIB anyway. European countries would join, so this ship was really sailed. And what the World Bank did was to help co-design the AIIB to make sure that it would comply with international development standards. And you even have World Bank officials joining the AIIB. They're doing joint projects. At the same time, the World Bank has also reorganized its own portfolio to focus more on strengths like human investment, less on infrastructure. So we see adaptive approaches there. We see a similar thing with the International Energy Agency, although belated. It took a new director general to come in the International Energy Agency before they started adopting to climate targets. But I think also there, through type of layering strategy, by putting renewables, climate, energy transition on top of its core strategy about energy security, they have adapted their mandate. And in the OSCE, we essentially have seen downscaling of its activities, also in light of what Europe has been doing. When it comes to type of direct challenges of Trump, we see strongly resistance in the case of climate change. The climate regime was not going to go along with the idea of Trump that climate is a hoax. So I think they've really tried to resist that, and I'll talk a bit later about that. They've particularly done it through activating their external network of all sorts of NGOs, but also sub-state actors in the United States. We see on NATO that on the discursive field, they have adopted a bit on burden sharing. So, they've often said, Mr. President Trump, you're right on burden sharing, but they have below the below the radar. They've tried to heavily resist behavioral policy on Russia by going through State Department, Defense Department, ignoring essentially the White House. So that was quite an elaborate strategy of dealing with Trump during the first term. World Trade Organization appellate body was essentially no response. The World Trade Organization did not manage to foresee the problem coming, and they did not manage to do anything. If anything, it was the European Union as an outside actor that took a number of steps there. So we haven't put anything in there, but it came closer to resistance than adaptive behavior, which would be in line with the proposition. I want to move on to the second proposition, and what we've here done is grouped all the case studies on the basis of the outcome variable, the extent to which there was a response from World Bank and NATO as the most proactive response to World Trade Organization and OSCE, to essentially no response with the UNFCCC and IAEA in the middle. And we see that it quite neatly relates to leadership structure and in some cases also network. Now, this is a type of comparative table we've put in the conclusion. I think a lot of the evidence is obviously in the case description, where we highlight within the chapters how leadership mattered, how organizational structure mattered, and so forth. The one curiosity, I think, across the cases is formal competences. So we didn't necessarily find conclusive results here. It's also a bit difficult because in a lot of the coding of international organizations, the World Trade Organization is coded as having very significant competences because it has an appellate body. But in reality, for instance, Director General of the World Trade Organization has very limited formal competences. So we've been running into a bit this variable as inconclusive. So for us, that remains a bit of a question mark. And one argument we give in the book, in line with research on informal governance, is that when things become really tough, when things become really messy, and a crisis occurs, actors fall back on informal ways of working together and ignore the type of formal rules of the game. But I think this is one of these things that where simply our variables were not confirmed. I would then want to move further beyond essentially the book and say a few words on what I see the future of international organizations. And I think these are type of questions we've been asked a lot over the last 6 weeks or so since the publication of our book. So a few observations to try to make sense of what's going on now. I think there is, for us, a type of big difference between Trump 2 and Trump 1. I think what has often been said already is the avalanche of things, the speed with which things happen is much quicker. It's worth reminding that even though Trump withdrew in his first year from the Paris Agreement, or announced that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, he only withdrew from the World Health Organization in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. So year 4 of his first term. All these things now happen on day 1. So I think the speed is quite considerable. He has also ordered a 180-day review of all treaties. So that's not just international organizations, it's literally all treaties that the United States has ever signed, and the State Department needs to go through their treaty room and consider, whether these treaties are worth keeping for the American First agenda. So the speed and the scope are considerable. What I also find interesting here is that the method has changed. I think during Trump 1, we really saw that they followed legal protocol, believe it or not. So one of the interesting things about the Paris Agreement was that even though they announced the withdrawal in I think it was June, July 2017, they could not withdraw until November 2020 because of stipulations in the Paris Agreement that said that there would be a 3-year period after the Paris Agreement would have entered into force. They abided by that. They also abided by the legal stipulation in the World Health Organization that said that it would take a year to withdraw. So they put in motion the withdrawal procedure, but by the time that year would kick in, Biden was president and rescinded that order. So in a way, they did follow legal procedures. Over NATO, there was always a discussion if Trump wants to withdraw. That's possible, but then there would have to be a majority in Congress and so forth. I think we're no longer seeing that type of formal legal proper procedure. So I think that has really changed. The other thing what we see is type of hostility through sanctions on International Criminal Court and increasingly issue linkage. So if you bother us, even if we're not a member of an international organization, but if you bother us, we'll hit back somewhere else. So I think that's quite a drastic change. I think also fundamentally what we've seen in this book is that type of external support networks are so important for international organizations. The international organizations that think that they can just stay a club by diplomats for diplomats won't survive very long. It's important that they have that basis, and you see many international organizations now organizing public forums, opening up obviously to non-governmental organizations, engaging in public diplomacy and so forth. But what I find worrying essentially about the Trump administration, but more broadly, is that this external support base for international organizations seems to be eroding. In the United States, particularly, I haven't seen massive protests in favor of climate change of the kind that we did have during the first Trump administration. And we actually see that, the work of domestic climate change scientists is being made incredibly difficult within the United States. The cutting of USAID is once again an example where you essentially undermine the whole domestic structure that supports also these international organizations. I think this is something that's really new and we need to reckon with. I think also compared to the first type of Trump term, we now risk cascades of other member states. So I might be, miss one or two cases, but I don't think that any other member state has joined in the withdrawal of international organizations during the Trump term, with the exception of Israel also quitting UNESCO. These days, things I think are different. Other member states might leave as well, from Argentina and the World Health Organization to others. And then I think it's no longer just the US and it's no longer just Trump. It becomes a wider phenomenon. I also think we in Europe, we need to look at ourselves. Simply the agenda of strategic autonomy, let's build a big defense base here, or let's have a more assertive trade policy, really risks undermining multilateralism. I mean, the last couple of days, the talk about let's build a nuclear deterrent nuclear weapon in Europe beyond the French one, quite quickly sidesteps the fact that we have a non-proliferation treaty that gets, that serves an important purpose as well, but that gets eroded by such European initiatives. So I think we need to look more broadly than Trump. I've also mentioned obviously the BRICS, China, and so forth. So I think that's something that worries me quite a bit. In this book, we also make a case in our preface that we should remain, a sense of optimism and not be too pessimistic, because ultimately the world needs to be governed, whether we like it or not. We will have to tackle climate change at some point. We will have to deal with pandemics. We will have to deal with digital and so forth. And the alternative solutions are simply very costly. I think the book also shows that institutions tend to be sticky actors. IO actors are highly motivated survivors. There's considerable buy-in from around the world still in our international system of multilateralism. Research by colleagues, for instance, also shows that in cases where the United States withdraws from international organizations, in 80% of the cases, international organizations perfectly survive those type of challenges. So I think it should not be all doom and gloom. I think we need to better understand what's going on at the international organization level, so not just the state level, in order to draw conclusions. Let me just wrap up very briefly, and then my time is up. So this book is about the responses of international organizations to existential challenges. And we've argued that IOs can be surprisingly proactive when their livelihood is put at risk. And we make two propositions here that IOs respond differently depending on the existential challenges that they face. We also, and that's our proposition number 2, argue that IO actors vary in their strength, and that affects the type of strategicness of their response. If they have a stronger internal leadership or organizational structure and networks, they are better at tailoring their responses to these type of challenges. They have more options on the table. We draw in this book on evidence from 6 case studies and more than 100 interviews. So we really try to give an in-depth overview of what has been going on in all these organizations behind the scenes. And I think we conclude today by saying that the current challenges to international organizations are very serious. This book was written before Trump entered into office. But we should, I think, at the same time also avoid too much pessimism, avoid the downward spiral, avoid that we now say, well, international organizations are a legacy of the post-45 era. They're 8 decades old, and yeah, we should do something else. I think that would defeat essentially the purpose. So I'm going to stop here and close the PowerPoint as well. So I think that everybody can see us better on the screen.
Thank you very much, Hylke. This is a really interesting and very thorough overview of your book. I'm sure you've inspired many people to click over to that link and read it themselves. But now I'll pass over to you, Edith. And I just want to remind the audience one more time, the Q&A with the audience is about to begin. So feel free to send any questions to the Q&A function. Over to you, Edith.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, thank you, Carrie. Thank you for giving me the floor, but also for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on this new book by Hylke and colleagues on indeed the strategies that international organizations use to confront so-called existential threats to their survival. I start with some comments and then I'll raise some questions. That was my brief, actually. I must say, I find it incredibly refreshing to see and is also read such an optimistic book at a time when indeed doom and gloom seem to increasingly dominate the discourse surrounding this world of international organization. Many question indeed whether these organizations can survive in today's global order or reorder or disorder, or whatever name you would like to put at it. But this book delivers an optimistic and even a hopeful message. It's a message of yes, yes, international organizations remain relevant also in today's seemingly ever-evolving global landscape. I think you could say that explicitly or implicitly, international organizations, they embody the idealist dream of peace on earth, prosperity on earth. And this dream is often dismissed by critics as being very or rather naive. But I think they will find it rather difficult to dismiss also this rather optimistic book as wishful thinking. It's everything but daydreaming, it's everything but speculation. It's rigorous and rich academic research. And this brings me to the key strengths of this book. In my view, this book integrates 3 key strengths of, let's call it, strong academic work. I think, first of all, it provides a very insightful review of the relevant literatures. It not only provides an overview of an incredible amount of studies, but also a synthesis of this knowledge in the studies. A second strength is the solid theoretical groundwork. So the modeling The testing of the modeling and also the refining of the explanations, they are done in a remarkably consistent manner for a project of this size. And it's a collective project of a very important size. And I think the third strength would be, of course, and Hylke already mentioned it, the rich empirical analysis. The book is based on no fewer than 114 interviews. That is a lot. It must have been great fun, but that must have been also quite challenging at times. And I think taking together, so the literature review, the theoretical modeling, and also the empirical analysis, well, if you bring them together, this makes the book a timely but also an essential addition to the literature. And here I would like to come back to something that Hylke also mentioned at the start of the presentation. When reading the book, I was actually generally surprised to see how limited the research is on the function of international organizations in today's world. So the IO level of analysis, these organizations seem to be everywhere, but they turn out to be nowhere at the same time. They're frequently mentioned, but they're just as often overlooked and often underestimated because of that. Maybe a simple observation, but I found it quite eye-opening, and it really shows that much more work needs to be done on this very interesting world of international organizations. And then I would also like to add something to the presentation. I want to comment the final pages of the book, which offer some very concrete policy recommendation. And I think the clarity of the recommendations and maybe also the simplicity of these recommendations make this book very useful for practitioners. The practitioners, they can find very concrete steps that can be taken to assure the continued relevance and perhaps even the survival of the international organizations in which they work. So this was a bit my comments, my words of praise. And now I would like to go to some questions. Before doing that, I would like to add a few more things. When reading Hylke's book, well, it actually reminded me of how interesting and how dynamic this world of international organization is. You often feel it when you have the privilege of walking around in headquarters, in offices, in buildings, but you don't always feel it when you read papers, when you read articles, when you read blogs, when you read tweets about this world of international organization. I don't want to idealize this world. I don't want to romanticize this world. And yes, indeed, the limitations of cooperation are often, specifically in today's world, disappointing, sometimes even shocking. But there is also another side, a more encouraging side to this world of international organization. Hylke, your book enlightened me, but also confused me. Confusing, but confusing in a good way. It gave me a lot of answers, but also a lot of questions. I think that every page came at least with one question. There's a lot of richness in the book, so that means that there's also a lot of room for questions. There are a lot of pages in the book, 181. I won't come up with 181 questions here. I'll just limit myself to three, let's call it, more broader questions to open the debate. So my first question is about the magic formula. In the book, in the concluding sections, you emphasize the need for tailoring because you conclude, for instance, that different types of challenges logically demand different responses. I know that you always push yourself further, so I would also like to push you a little bit further here. I would like to challenge you a bit more here. Is it possible to come up with some kind of magic formula for survival? You have identified a number of factors, a number of variables, but what about their interplay, their interactions? Could an alternative approach, maybe a QCA analysis, be helpful in this regard? So to establish the combination of factors and explanations for success, so for survival. More generally, what kind of research would be needed to develop such a magic formula? That will be my first question. My second question is actually a follow-up question. I'm not going to wait for your response. I'm just going to do the follow-up question right away. It's about your case selection. You explain your case selection in the book. You also justify it. You also did it in the presentation. But all your cases involve international organizations under threat. And this made me think. could it be useful, specifically in light of the search for a magic formula, to incorporate also negative cases in future research? So organizations that don't face existential threats, or only to a very limited extent, to seeing such negative cases as successful cases. So differently put, could you reflect a little bit further on your case selection? Would you make different decisions if you would have sounds very negatively, if you've had to start over? And then my third question is about your conclusion. It was also in the presentation, optimism, hope. Aren't you too optimistic? The success factors that you list cannot easily be changed in the short term or by the will, as you refer to it, the will of international organizations. So by the organizations themselves, so the structure, the competences, the embeddedness, and the leadership. So doesn't this conclusion make you a little bit too optimistic when talking about the survival of these international organizations? So that would have been my three questions, but I have a fourth one. I have one from my students. Today is master thesis day. That means that I have back-to-back meetings with my master thesis students, and some of them are basically working on this world of international organizations. I had one student this morning, and she's working on the IOM, and I had another student who is working on the Security Council. They find it quite interesting to work on these organizations, but also quite challenging. So they had a question. And the question is, how can we as students research international organizations and contribute to the literature without doing extensive field work? So without doing the interviews. And they would greatly appreciate if you would come up with one do, not one don't, but actually one do. So thank you very much for sharing the magic and for sharing the book with me. And I think sincere congratulations to you and your colleagues are in order for this impressive undertaking. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Edith. We'll pass directly over to you, Hylke.
Yeah, thank you, Edith, very much for those questions, and particularly for the praise. It's a lot. So after this webinar, I'm going to go through the notes once more and actually enjoy all the points you made. If I may, I would like to start with that type of final question because I think it's an important one. I think one of the frustrating things about this doing the research on this book was that a lot of the field work was during COVID, so included also with these type of Zoom interviews. And I think you quite rightly mentioned earlier that there's nothing like it than walking through the buildings, be it the UN complex in New York, or even some of the smaller ones. Most international organizations have less than 30 staff members. They're small offices, and you get a sense of the place. So I would very much recommend your students to still try see whether they can go places and do a couple of interviews as a way of inspiration. And at the same time, I think we have these technologies to meet people from all over the world. We can use them, and I think there are also a lot of other type of resources. The League of Nations archive, for instance, is now entirely online available. So for the historians amongst us, I think that's a great resource, and colleagues don't have to go to Geneva anymore, even though a trip to Geneva is still certainly worth doing. So I would try to be a bit creative in that sense, but I certainly feel the tension there. I think on the magic formula, so I think what we've done in this project, in addition to type of case study work, we've also done quantitative work, and there the non-cases also come in because we've been looking at the death and survival of all international organizations that were ever established. In total, the authoritative data set, Correlates of War, has 534 international organizations, of which 200 have been terminated, replaced, or integrated. So I think that's really a great resource to study from a quantitative perspective, which ones survive longer in terms of years since their foundation. So I think we've done that. The drawback there, of course, is that the variables become quite limiting. So in our project, we look, for instance, at number of staff members that an international organization has. Does it have a lot of staff? Does it have a few staff members? And we look at other things like, does it have withdrawal clauses in the treaties? But I think these are still quite elementary variables. And what we really wanted to do in this book is also get the picture behind those variables. So the 6 case studies in terms of selection, they all have more than 250 staff members on the payroll. So we're talking about relatively big international organizations. And we wanted to really figure out, how do these survival strategies work in practice. So in that sense, the book and the case studies also complement other larger work, and I think it all points in the same direction, except that this book gives considerably more nuance than the quantitative work. Not so sure whether the median n is a way out here, or whether we can really provide the necessary and sufficient conditions type of formula that we then should hide from the people who are currently in the White House, because that's, I think, also the normative type flip side of this type of research, right? That we write a handbook on, how to ruin international organizations, or although they seem to be quite capable of doing that themselves. But it's something on our minds. I think one of the things also with this type of case study work is that you start appreciating factors when going into the research, and I think particularly external network is something that came up, or organizational structure in the World Trade Organization. The absence of formal competences was something that surprised us as well. So if I would have to follow up, I would start from a research design that really zooms in on a couple of these surprising points to get more evidence for them. I could go on forever in response to your questions, but I also know that time is limited. So I was hoping, Carrie, that we have some people in the audience with questions as well.
Thank you, Hylke.
That we do. We have several questions, so I'll start with 3, and maybe we'll have a chance for another round. The first one is fairly provocative, asking what your thoughts are about the most famous counterexample, the demise of the League of Nations before the Second World War. How would you react to this, and how does your methodology apply to it? And then we have another one, looking sort of towards newer IOs, whether your conclusions apply similarly to these newer IOs that are not part of the post-World War II legacy, and are in different power compositions, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS Plus, and what does their creation teach us about international organizations' current role in global governance? We also have a few different questions that I'm going to kind of lump together on the various internal differences of international organizations that may or may not be covered within your categorization of structure and leadership. But we've had a few different ones, so I'll bring them up. Some IOs have different decision-making structures. You have the WTO making decisions by consensus, and others like the World Bank operating via voting. You also have decision-making authority spread out differently based on weighting systems via economic contributions, or others that are more egalitarian, one country, one vote. Then you also have differences in terms of funding and certainty from funding, and different funding structures with voluntary contributions and so on. States are able to destabilize international organizations by failing to fund them or by making key appointments and don't necessarily have to exit. So there's these different sort of institutional features, and how would these fit into your categorization and your comparative study? Do these figure into your components of leadership and structure and that kind of thing? Maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and give a little bit more insight into how you made those calls. Oh, and the other institutional feature was authority of sanctions. So these are the different ones that have popped up in the different questions. And then I think that is 3 questions. Maybe we'll just squeeze in one more. The United Nations is, by its very nature, an intergovernmental organization. This one's from Birgit van Hout from the United Nations Population Fund. She is saying that calls for inclusive multilateralism from the Secretary General, for instance, in the Our Common Agenda, have failed to encounter support from states. So what are the implications for the future of the UN based on your comments about clubs for diplomats? So we'll start with those 4, and we'll see if we have time for any more.
Thank you so much. I think these are a bunch of great questions, and I would be happy to talk a whole hour on the League of Nations, which I think is a pet project as well, of some of our research. I think in many ways the League of Nations and also Brexit are the two cases that everybody seems to refer to intellectually when it comes to either the death of international organizations or their withdrawal from international organizations. And I think we theorize on the basis of the League of Nations along the lines of, when war happens, international organizations fall apart, right? I mean, I think there's a League argument, and the Brexit argument is when international organizations become too powerful, too much authority, states start to contest it and withdraw from them. And that's perhaps right, and I think in both of these cases, but I think there are also outliers when really taking the international organization level of analysis. There are organizations where many more countries withdraw from than the EU. I mean, Brexit was really a once for the moment, and the League of Nations is always mentioned as see what could also happen to the UN. The trouble here is that what very few people realize is the League of Nations was ultimately an organization run by the French and the Brits until the breakout of the Second World War, when it really was run and funded by the Brits. At the moment that the tanks of Nazi Germany were encircling Geneva, at that point, Nazi Germany, Italy, Japan had already withdrawn. The Soviet Union had been expelled from the League of Nations. So I like to say, as long as tanks are not surrounding New York yet, perhaps it's not historically contingent to make these parallels. I think it was fairly specific. It was an experiment, the League, in many ways as well. That I find difficult to one-to-one put on current international organizations. Historians would furthermore tell us that there's so many continuities between the work done at the League that lived on throughout the UN system afterwards. That's something to be considered as well. But that's enough about the League. I think on the newer IOs, I think what's interesting is that what particularly what we've seen since the end of the Cold War is more emphasis on informal international institutions, public-private partnerships, different type of forms of cooperation. And I'm skeptical there whether those ones that are not necessarily treaty-based and have the characteristics of formal international organizations will be equally robust as the type of template used when setting up international organizations after the Second World War. So I think that our book also speaks essentially to that these international characteristics are really important, and that we need to pay attention to them. So yes, I think that matters a great deal, but not necessarily in a positive way. I like all the comments on the institutional differences between international organizations. And yes, probably all of them mentioned are relevant to survival. Funding is indeed really a big topic. But what we've tried to do in this book is also in a way make a first cut across case studies by looking at 4 variables. So leadership for us is really cross-cutting one. Then secondly, looking at how secretariats are organized in terms of their structure, the role of institutional actors in the broader international organization, so that's the formal competences, and their role in external networks beyond the international organizations. I think we've taken, I think, 4 logical variables, but I think there are many more. Overall, I think the picture does point in the direction, well, listen, we need to pay attention to these institutional characteristics, like organizational structure, like leadership. So I wouldn't be surprised if funding also turns out as critical. It's just not something that we explicitly looked for, but it certainly goes in a similar direction. Maybe on the UN and inclusive multilateralism. I think in many ways the Summit for the Future was a smart attempt at UN reform. I also wrote a brief post-summit article on this. Essentially, what Gutierrez did was say, well, listen, we're not going to have charter reform, so we're not going to be reforming the Security Council and all that. We're going to add an additional layer over the UN 2.0, where we're going to be addressing some of the common challenges really coming out of COVID with pandemics and so forth. Except the member states hijacked it. And the member states said, well, we want to talk about Security Council reform because the Security Council is deeply unfair. So I think that, to me, was really the challenge there. I think a misreading then perhaps also from UN leadership about what was possible. But I think in general, I quite like the approach, and I think it's still the way forward for UN reform. I think we've reached the end of the webinar, so I'll give back the floor, Carrie.
Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, we are out of time. We have many more questions, but I will pass them along to you by email so you can have a look. There's lots of really good questions that came through today. But I would like to once again thank both Edith and Hylke for joining us today. This has been a very interesting discussion. And before leaving you, I just want to remind you that our spring lineup is available on our website, which is eu-renew.eu. And you can do a /webinars to find our spring schedule, which will bring in Petro Mavroidis, Wolfgang Weiss, Cornelia Fergulita, and Jennifer Clapp in the next couple of months. You can sign up for those there. Thank you for joining us, Professor Hylke Dijkstra and Professor Edith Drieskens. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.